Hey guys, in today's video, I bring you a simply unbelievable story full of surprising revelations. Let's meet Tempest Draven, a woman who faced death in a devastating accident and returned with an urgent message straight from Jesus. What he revealed about the symbols we use on a daily basis will leave you speechless and completely change your worldview. So before we start, leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this. Now, get ready for this intense and transformative journey. It was January in Anchorage, and winter was in full swing. The snow fell in large flakes, covering everything in a blanket of white. I was driving home from a corporate event, something I almost canceled due to bad weather, but the responsibilities were heavy, and I decided to go. That night, the roads were treacherous, covered in ice and partially visible under the drifting snow. I held the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension. "It's going to be okay," I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the sound of the wind howling as a grim warning. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but visibility was almost nil. I was barely halfway there when I saw lights in the rearview mirror. It was a truck, and it seemed to be approaching too fast. My heart raced. No," he murmured, stepping on the brakes gently to avoid skidding. But then it happened. The truck lost control, sliding to the right side and coming directly towards me. The impact was devastating. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The sound of twisting metal and shattering glass filled my ears as my body was thrown against the seatbelt. The last thing I saw was the car dashboard folding like paper, before everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the car, or at least that's what it seemed like. I was floating above the scene, watching my own body trapped in the wreckage. It was surreal. Like watching a movie in third person. I saw the paramedics running, trying to open what was left of my car with hydraulic tools. One of them shouted, "We have a victim trapped. She's still alive, but with serious injuries." I should have felt pain, fear, something, but all I felt was a strange relief. There was no sound of sirens, no sensation of being in my body. It was as if I was in a state of suspension, beyond time and space. And it was there, in the silence of that moment, that I began to realize that something much bigger was happening. Floating above the scene was disconcerting to say the least. There was no pain, just a strange calm, as if the weight of my entire existence had been left behind along with my body. I looked down and saw chaos. My car was completely destroyed, the metal twisted as if it had been crushed by a gigantic hand. Inside it, I was there, unconscious, with a pale face and a trickle of blood running down my forehead. The paramedics moved quickly, using tools to try to free me. I saw one of them press 2 fingers against my neck, checking my pulse. He shook his head, as if he was saying something to himself, but I couldn't hear anything. The silence was absolute, as if the physical world was too far away to reach my ears. "She's alive, but she's critical. We need to get her out now," one of them shouted, but again I didn't hear the words, just read the movement of his lips. I felt a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Is this really happening? I thought. I tried to get the attention of one of the paramedics, but they didn't react. My hands, or what felt like my hands, passed through them as if I were a breeze. Then something happened. A force began to pull me up. It was not violent, but firm and irresistible. The physical world became smaller, as if I were rising beyond the reach of gravity. I looked back, seeing my body getting further and further away, and a question began to grow inside me. Is this how it ends? That's when I realized something extraordinary. I wasn't alone. There was a presence with me, although I couldn't see it clearly. It was as if she was being guided by invisible hands, enveloped in an energy that conveyed peace and security. I didn't feel afraid, but there was an intense curiosity, a desire to know where I was going. The light around me began to change. The sky that was previously dark because of the snowstorm gave way to something completely different, a tunnel of pulsating energy, with vibrant and indescribable colors. It was as if I were passing through layers of reality, each one lighter and more radiant than the last. And then, the question that echoed in my mind changed. It was no longer, is this how it ends? But rather, what next? When I emerged from the tunnel of light, I was enveloped by a world that seemed to be made of pure energy. It was hard to describe, but imagine a place where colors are not just seen, but felt. The air, if there was air, seemed full of life. It was as if each particle pulsed with a symphony that went straight to the soul. I looked around me, trying to understand where I was. There was no sun, but the room was bathed in a golden light that seemed to come from everywhere. The floor felt solid, but it wasn't made of anything I could identify. It was like walking on a liquid crystal surface, shiny and translucent. In the distance, hills undulated gently, covered in a luminous mist that seemed to breathe. It was then that I noticed a presence. Before I saw him, I felt him. A wave of warmth and love enveloped me, so intense it made my knees, or what I believed were my knees, give out. He was there, Jesus. I didn't need any introductions. There was no doubt. His presence was unmistakable, radiating love, compassion, and a holiness that felt overwhelming and yet comforting. He was clothed in something that seemed to be made of light, and his eyes were infinite, as if they contained the entire universe. "Arise, daughter," he said, and his words were not only heard, were felt in every part of my being. His voice was like the sound of a river, tranquil yet full of power. I don't know what's going on," I stammered, still on my knees. He approached, extended his hand, and, with a simple touch, made me stand up. The touch wasn't just physical. It was as if he was transmitting all the peace and love in the universe directly to me. "You are in a place between worlds," he explained. "You're not here by chance." Before I could respond, images began to appear around me, like projections on an invisible screen. They were views of the physical world, but seen from a completely different perspective. I saw symbols I recognized from everyday life: the peace symbol, the Ankh, the Eye of Horus, the Ouroboros. But around them was something disturbing. It was as if they were shrouded in shadow, emitting vibrations that seemed discordant, out of tune with the peace of that place. "These symbols are not what they seem," he said, his voice firm but full of compassion. "They have a hidden purpose, and you need to know the truth about them." The intensity of the moment left me speechless. I knew my life would never be the same again. Jesus extended his hand and, with a gesture, the images around us became clearer. Familiar symbols began to appear, floating in a sphere of light. The symbol of peace, the Ankh, the Eye of Horus, and the Ouroboros loomed before me. But now I saw them differently. Each one seemed to pulse with its own energy, but it was not a benign energy. It was as if something inside them was corrupted, vibrating at a frequency that didn't match the harmony of that place. "These symbols are not just designs or ornaments," Jesus began, his voice charged with an authority that seemed to reverberate in the air around me. "They are tools, portals, instruments used to manipulate and deceive." My heart sank. I had previously used some of these symbols in jewelry and decoration. I remembered an Eye of Horus pendant that I bought at a crafts fair, and a tapestry with Ouroboros that decorated my living room. "But how?" I asked. They're so common, so harmless." Jesus took a step toward me and looked at me with such intense compassion that tears began to roll down my face. "They were designed to appear harmless, but each of them has a hidden spiritual purpose." He pointed to the symbol of peace. "It works like a spiritual antenna, but its energy does not connect to the divine. It diverts the natural vibrations of the soul, creating interference. This is why many who use it feel spiritual confusion, without knowing why." The Ankh came next. "The Ankh is a spiritual transmitter," he explained. "Although it was used in ancient cultures to symbolize life, today it is corrupted. It connects evil forces to the physical world, draining spiritual energy from people who use it or have contact with it." The Eye of Horus seemed to glow eerily as he explained it. "This is more than a symbol of protection or wisdom. It is a spiritual surveillance device. It alters people's perceptions, blinding them to the truth and even distorting the way the brain works." Finally, he indicated the Ouroboros, the serpent that devours its own tail. "This represents a cycle of spiritual imprisonment," he said, with a sadness evident in his voice. "Many souls who come into contact with him find it difficult to break destructive patterns in their lives." I was astonished. "So these symbols aren't just fashion or art?" I asked, still trying to process. "No," he replied, his expression firm. "They are tools of deception, created to weaken the divine connection, obscure the truth, and create obstacles in the spiritual journey." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he continued, with an urgency in his voice. "Your mission is to warn others. Many are trapped without knowing it, their souls affected by these influences. It is not too late to open their eyes." I looked at him, feeling the weight of this revelation and the responsibility that came with it. How can I do this? Who will believe me? You have been chosen, he said simply. I will be with you. The images around me began to change, transforming into scenes from the physical world. I saw ordinary people, families, children, professionals, students, interacting with these symbols in ways that seemed harmless. A man wore the symbol of peace like a sticker on your car. A woman wore a necklace with Ankh hanging. Children played with toys that displayed the Eye of Horus. Even company logos and book covers were saturated with the Ouroboros and other geometric patterns. Jesus reached out his hand again, and the scenes became more intense. Each person who used or interacted with these symbols seemed to be surrounded by a faint gray mist, almost imperceptible, but obscuring the light around them. These symbols create spiritual barriers, he explained, his voice calm but full of weight. They function as distraction and manipulation devices. Those who carry, use, or idolize them are subject to a kind of spiritual static, which weakens their ability to connect to the divine. As he spoke, the scenes changed again. I saw a woman kneeling in prayer, but she seemed to be struggling to find focus. Around his neck hung a pendant with the Ankh. It was as if the symbol drained his energy, diverting his intentions. They don't block completely, Jesus continued, but they create enough noise to make spiritual clarity difficult. It's like trying to hear a melody through a static-filled radio. He pointed to another scene, a child sleeping in a room decorated with Ouroboros patterns. There was something dark in the air, a sense of restlessness. The child shifted, looking uncomfortable. The Ouroboros not only represents cyclical imprisonment, Jesus said, but it can also create a heavy spiritual environment, especially for the vulnerable, such as children. The most disturbing impact, however, came when he showed the Eye of Horus. In one vision, a man was wearing a ring with the symbol. His expression was hard, and there seemed to be a shadow in his eyes. This symbol distorts spiritual, even physical perception, Jesus explained. It alters the way people think, creating blind spots that make it difficult to discern what is true and what is manipulation. I lay still, trying to take it all in. But what if someone doesn't know? If they simply use these symbols without evil intent? I asked, my voice full of concern. Deception is in your nature, Jesus replied. Ignorance does not completely protect you, but it is possible to redeem yourself. With prayer, faith, and the conscious choice to remove these influences, spiritual doors can be closed. The weight of those words was crushing. How many times had I used these symbols myself without thinking twice? How many people around me could be suffering without even knowing it? Do you understand now why you must return? He asked, his gaze piercing. The world needs to know. Even if many reject it, you will plant the seed. The images began to fade, replaced by the intense presence of Jesus. His expression was compassionate, but there was a weight in his voice that made me realize the gravity of what he was about to say. Tempest, you need to go back, he said, with a firmness that echoed in every part of my being. What you saw here cannot stay with you alone. It is a truth that many need to hear, but few are prepared to accept. To go back? I asked him with a lump in my throat. My physical body felt like a distant memory, and the thought of returning to the world, to the pain, the struggles, the chaos, was almost unbearable. But how? I feel like I belong here. Everything here is peace. Jesus approached, his eyes reflecting a love that knew no bounds. I know it's difficult. You have experienced what few can understand. But your journey is not over yet. You have been chosen to take this message to the world, to warn and protect souls who are being unknowingly manipulated. My hands, or what felt like my hands, were shaking. How can I do this? Who will believe me? I barely know how to begin to explain what I saw here. He reached out his hand, and as he touched it, a wave of peace ran through my being. Don't worry about who will believe. Do your part. Share what you saw and heard. The seeds will be planted, and it is each person's free will that will determine whether they will flourish. For a moment I was silent, absorbing his words. There was an intensity to everything he said, but also a gentleness that made me feel seen, understood. What if I fail? I whispered. You will not fail, he replied, with a small smile. Even if you face skepticism, opposition, and moments of doubt, the simple act of sharing the truth is a victory. Remember, I will be with you, always. Suddenly, I felt something different. A force began to pull me back, as if the spiritual world was slowly closing in around me. Despair took over me. "I don't want to leave," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Please let me stay." He came closer once more, placing his hand on my shoulder. "You will come back one day, but not today. There is still a lot to do." The last words I heard before everything disappeared were, "You have a mission. Trust me." Then everything went dark. The darkness that enveloped me was thick, but not oppressive. It was like absolute silence, a gap between two worlds. Suddenly, a strange sensation began to emerge, a throbbing pain, followed by crushing pressure in my chest. I heard distant, muffled voices, as if someone were talking to me underwater. "Turn on the defibrillator. We're going to lose her." Then came the shock. My entire body felt like it was exploding in agony. It was like being ripped from a place of infinite peace and thrown back into a heavy, dense world. My chest expanded, taking in the first breath in an eternity. I opened my eyes for a moment, but the hospital's fluorescent lights were too bright. "She's back. We have a pulse," I heard the voice of a paramedic exclaiming with relief, but I couldn't process what was happening. My body was exhausted, destroyed, like a fragile shell trying to contain something much larger. Each breath was a monumental effort. The flashes of the experience I had started to come in waves. The tunnel of light, the visions of the symbols, the words of Jesus. Everything seemed so far away, like a dream, but the intensity of it still burned inside me. I knew it hadn't been a hallucination or something in my mind. It had been real. As I was transferred to the hospital, doctors and nurses worked frantically around me. I felt needles being inserted into my arms, tubes connected to my body, oxygen masks forcing air into my lungs, but my mind wasn't completely there. "You were lucky to survive," a doctor said after I woke up hours later. She had hair tied in a bun and a tired but relieved expression. His condition was critical, but something changed. I don't know how to explain it, but his recovery was faster than anything I've ever seen. I wanted to respond, explain what had happened, but the words seemed stuck. My body ached with every movement, and the idea of putting into words what I had witnessed seemed impossible at that moment. As I lay in the hospital bed, with tubes and machines around me, the mission Jesus had given me weighed heavily on my mind. His words still echoed, "You have been chosen. Do your part." It was there, lying in bed, that I realized that my life would never be the same. My physical recovery was surprisingly quick, something doctors described as miraculous. In a few weeks, I managed to leave the hospital, even though I still carried some scars and limitations. But the real challenge was not recovering my body, but finding the courage to share what I had experienced. The first time I told my story, it was to my sister, Sienna. She has always had an open mind to the spiritual, so I thought she would be the first to understand. We sat in the living room of her house, warmed by a fireplace while the snow was still falling outside. "I need to tell you something that happened to me. Something that changed everything," I began, trying to keep my voice steady, even with my heart racing. She looked at me curiously, setting aside the cup of tea she was holding. "What is it? You have said so little about the accident." As I recounted my experience going from the tunnel of light to meeting Jesus and the revelations about the symbols, her eyes widened. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Are you saying that these symbols, things we see everywhere, are dangerous?" She looked incredulous, but didn't dismiss it immediately. "Yes," I replied, my voice wavering. "They are not what they seem to be. They manipulate our spiritual energies. They create barriers between us and God. Jesus showed me all of this." Sienna held my hand, but her gaze was full of doubt. "I believe you've been through something real, Tempest. But this is all a lot to process. Don't you think it could be a reflection of the trauma you've experienced?" I knew I would face skepticism, but hearing this from my own sister felt like a blow. She wasn't rejecting my experience completely, but she didn't seem ready to accept it either. The reactions of others were much worse. When I tried to share my story with a small support group at my local church, I was met with suspicious and even hostile looks. "Gosh, this sounds like heresy," said one of the members, a middle-aged man with a Bible in hand. "Are you saying that cultural and historical symbols are the work of evil forces? That's dangerous." "Do you really think it was Jesus you saw?" asked a woman. "How do you know it wasn't something else and something deceptive?" I left there feeling isolated and frustrated. I didn't expect everyone to believe it immediately, but the rejection and accusations made me question whether I would be able to fulfill the mission I was given. It was during one of these nights, alone in my small apartment, that Jesus' words came to me. You were chosen. Even if many reject you, plant the seed. Over time, I realized that my role was not to convince everyone, but simply to speak. Those who were ready to listen would come to me, and surprisingly, they started coming. A childhood friend who heard my story decided to remove all the symbols from her home and began to pray more intensely. A curious journalist wanted to document my story. Little by little, seeds were planted, and isolation gave way to a small circle of support. I knew the road would be long and full of challenges, but I also knew I was not alone on this journey. As time passed, I began to realize that my mission went beyond simply sharing what I had seen. It was also my duty to teach people how to protect themselves from the spiritual dangers that Jesus had revealed. This took courage. As each conversation seemed to be a battle between skepticism and faith, I began by removing everything from my own home that contained the symbols he had shown me. The first was the necklace with the ankh, which I loved using. It was a birthday present. But now, instead of bringing back good memories, it felt like an invisible weight. I held it in my hands before placing it in a box. I did the same with the tapestry Ouroboros that decorated my living room, and a bracelet with the symbol of peace. It's not enough to just remove them. Jesus' words echoed in my mind. It is necessary to close the spiritual doors that have been opened. So I began to pray, asking for divine protection and forgiveness for any spiritual influences I might have unconsciously accepted. It was a simple but powerful process that filled me with a peace I hadn't felt since the accident. When I started talking about these practices with others, the reactions were mixed. Some reacted with skepticism, but others began to see things in their lives that they had previously ignored. A woman at a prayer meeting confided, I always felt uncomfortable with a painting in my living room that had the Eye of Horus on it, but I thought it was just my imagination. After listening to you, I decided to take it out. Since then, my house feels lighter. I also started warning people about less obvious symbols. I showed how certain company logos and even geometric patterns on children's toys contained the same symbols that Jesus had shown me. It was disturbing to realize how rooted these elements were in everyday life. Many have no idea that these symbols are more than art or cultural tradition, I said. They are designed to create spiritual distraction, to confuse and weaken our connection with God. In addition to removing these objects, I encouraged people to pray regularly and study sacred texts to strengthen their faith and discernment. I also started talking about monitoring the content we consume, especially on digital media. The enemy is always looking for ways to get into our lives, I said. But God gave us the tools to protect ourselves: prayer, faith, and wisdom. It wasn't easy. I was often ridiculed for being an extremist or accused of wanting to spread fear. But there were those who listened to me, who took the message seriously and made changes in their lives. Each time this happened, I felt like the mission was being accomplished, even if it was one small step at a time. My life never went back to what it was before the accident. What once seemed simple, work, relationships, personal goals, now seemed small compared to what I had experienced. The weight of the mission Jesus gave me was constant, but it also came with a sense of purpose that I had never experienced. However, the difficulties were real. With each attempt to share my story, I faced challenges. Old friends avoided me, believing I had lost my mind or become a fanatic. Some people said my experience was the result of brain trauma or hallucination. Despite this, I couldn't back down. Jesus' words echoed in my mind. You have been chosen. I committed to continuing, even when it seemed like no one was listening. It wasn't my responsibility to change people's hearts, that was up to God. My task was to plant the seeds, regardless of the land they fell on. One night, as I prayed, I felt a deep peace that reminded me of the spiritual realm I had been to. It was as if Jesus was by my side again, confirming that I was on the right path. With this certainty, I began to expand my message. I created a small study group in my community, where I shared the revelations I received and taught how to pray for spiritual protection. Some people began to return, curious or even desperate for help. I remember a young mother who came to me crying. My son has been having constant nightmares. After listening to you, I removed a painting of the Eye of Horus that was in his room. The nightmares stopped that night. Stories like this gave me the strength to keep going. Even when I faced resistance, people started calling me paranoid or radical, but with each report of transformation, I knew it was worth it. Over time, I realized that this mission wasn't just about warning people about the dangers of symbols. It was about bringing souls back to the light, reconnecting them with God, and helping them see what was beyond the physical. Today, as I tell this story, I know I still have a long way to go. Many will continue to doubt or even ridicule what I say, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that the message is being shared. My name is Tempest Draven, and this is the mission given to me. Jesus showed me the truth, and I will return to him one day, knowing that I did everything I could to fulfill my purpose. Meanwhile, I continue planting seeds, hoping that one day they will bloom in people's hearts. If you like this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, comment on your impressions, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell to watch each new video and help us spread this message to a greater number of people. Until next time.